I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 94 of EORadioShow. For the next few episodes, we study fraud and fraud risks at nonprofit organizations. With the expert insight of Sly Atayee, a director at national accounting firm BDO USA, and a certified fraud examiner, today's episode launches the series with case studies of fraud at nonprofit organizations. Then in the next few episodes, we'll talk about 3 immediate steps your organization can take to mitigate fraud risks, and then big picture fraud prevention techniques for exempt organizations. Our last episode in the series, Ask a Certified Fraud Examiner, will answer listener questions sent to our mailbox at EORadioShow. Welcome to the EORadioShow, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sly Atayee for the first of 4 episodes where we study financial fraud in nonprofit organizations, looking at what happens when fraud is uncovered, and then studying effective techniques to prevent fraud in the first place. Sly is a director at BDO USA, and his work focuses on assisting exempt organizations with various aspects of forensic analysis and investigations. BDO is an international accounting firm that delivers assurance, tax, and advisory services to clients throughout the United States and around the globe. Sly has led numerous forensic analyses for exempt organizations, including field work domestically in the U.S. and internationally in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. He regularly supports clients with forensic investigations, financial process redesign, fraud prevention and mitigation, internal control assessments, complex cost recovery calculations, and policy and procedure development and support, and more. Sly has experience supporting in litigation matters, substantiating costs through collection of supporting documentation, and performing data analytics in order to calculate and quantify losses and damages. Welcome to the show, Sly. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Cynthia. I really appreciate you having me on the show, and I'm super excited to chat about some of the fraud risks that exempt organizations face today.
Yeah, this is great. It's such a topic that's always relevant. But before we get into the case studies, tell us a little bit about how you came to a career in forensic accounting.
Yeah, and I get this question a lot. I feel like I should probably put it somewhere in my bio or something. But I've been with BDO for about 9 years now and focused my work working with mission-driven exempt organizations. Originally, I started working with federal compliance, so helping organizations such as federal grantees comply with rules and regs that are associated with getting federal funding. And then that sometimes included investigations when federal dollars were at risk. So if a federal grantee got a grant and they had some sort of wrongdoing on the grant, in a lot of cases, you're kind of required to do an investigation to make sure that the government, if they were harmed, how much were they harmed or were they harmed at all? But I think for myself, I'd say I've always thought of myself as a natural problem solver. In a lot of cases, fraud cases are often like a puzzle, right? You don't really have a clear path. You might have a few clues here and there, but there's not a clear trail to get you to your outcome. And you kind of have to come up with those steps on your own. So I think this nature of this work kind of adapted to my natural skill sets. But more importantly, I'd say that the investigations work I always found a lot more meaningful because generally you're working with an organization that's in some sort of crisis, especially for exempt organizations. Instances of fraud or embezzlement are more damaging actually than just a regular, let's say, for-profit organization. And that's because they're dealing with obviously financial aspects if there's some potential money stolen, for example, but more importantly, in some cases, the reputational burden. Even a single instance of fraud, for example, or embezzlement can damage an organization's reputation. It can hurt the ability to support its mission, to raise money, its reputation with donors. And so it's kind of this magnifier where the financial aspect is just one piece, but there's actually a lot of other components as well. unfortunately for exempt organizations, these types of situations do happen a lot. I think there was a study done a while back at this point by the Washington Post, that said that 1/6 of all embezzlement was related to nonprofit and religious organizations. That was only second to the financial industry. I think that those of us who work in the exempt space understand that exempt organizations are highly susceptible to fraud and embezzlement. They're generally established for beneficial purposes and have kind of a trust-based motto, but in some cases that will lead to less stringent financial controls than, let's say, again, their for-profit counterparts. But I think for myself, kind of to wrap all that up, it's helping organizations get closure on these types of issues that really kind of gives my work meaning, but also helping them implement strategies to mitigate future issues or future fraud risks. And I know that's what we're going to get into on this series today, which I'm super excited about.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And I'll add a footnote. In California, exempt organizations that are supervised by the Attorney General's office, which doesn't include churches, so churches don't have to worry about this, but all the other charities that are registered have to report on their annual report to the AG's office if there has been fraud. And they have to give a detailed statement, and they have to explain how they tried to recover the assets, which is very different than for like private companies. I don't know about public companies, but private companies don't have to tell anybody as transparent. But for an exempt organization, a charity in California that's had a fraud issue, they have to investigate. They've got to track it down, and they've got to disclose it pretty publicly. So that's kind of scary for the California entities. With that lovely background, it's such an interesting conversation to talk about, but in the future episodes, we're really going to go into how to prevent this. But first, we're going to highlight some case studies that you've come across that I think really provide some good launching point for all the conversations. So tell us about some of the organizations that you've come across and how you went about doing your job, your part of that project.
Yeah, sure. So I think on today's episode, I'll go through 3 case studies. I'll talk a little bit about how we were brought in the first place, talk about what the issue was, and then talk about at a high level some of the control risks or the weaknesses that probably led to the organization experiencing the issue. And then we'll expand on some of those weaknesses and then turn them into opportunities for improvement in the future on our next couple of episodes. And we start talking about control improvements and things that orgs can do to avoid the same fate of the organizations we're going to talk about today. I think it probably goes without saying, but we obviously do a lot of sensitive work, and any type of fraud investigation is sensitive for any organization. And so all of our cases are either privileged or confidential. And so I'm going to speak about all the cases today anonymously, and in some cases leave out some details, and that's the reason why. So we just want to respect our clients, the sensitive nature of our clients' work. So the first case study was an interesting one that was about 2 years ago. We had what I'll just call a conservation organization, obviously an exempt organization, and they had a C-level or an executive level person that was charging the organization for what you could call exorbitant travel expenses, as well as allegedly personal travel expenses. We ended up doing the investigation. We were brought in actually through a finance executive that I had worked with at a previous exempt organization. So I kind of carried the relationship over into their new organization. And then when they had an issue pop up, they gave us a call right away. And we kind of talked through the risks with them and said, what do you want out of this? Which we always do with all of our clients on these types of cases. We ask the clients, what's your objective? Because in some cases, it may make sense to do a full-blown investigation if, let's say, you want to pursue some sort of legal action. But in other cases, organizations are just going to say, I think we have an opportunity here to improve our controls and then move forward from there. So it's really up to the client there. In this specific case, the organization needed some answers in terms of the dollars that were potentially at risk, and if this person was actually guilty of, charging personal expenses as well as travel expenses that were, well beyond reasonable. We ended up doing the investigation, and some key issues that popped up. We did see and we did find that the individual had altered receipts and invoices for travel expenses. It was made to look like they were basically incurring expenses that were less than what they actually were. And they were also trying to cover up personal expenses that they had been charging to their corporate credit card, which was reimbursed by the organization. when we look at some of the risks that led to this person being able to do this, there's obviously a lack of adherence to established policies. The organization actually did have policies that said you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, but they weren't enforcing those policies, right? Which I think reinforces the point that your policies are just pieces of paper until you actually put them into action and then you enforce them and you follow up on them. Otherwise, it's just a PDF document floating somewhere. Also, there was not really a lack of detailed review of expenses as well. So this individual essentially had been, doing this sort of practice for several months and even probably close to a year. And because nobody was really doing a deep dive into their expenses, it was only uncovered after almost a full year. And it took a new finance person to come onto the team that just decided to open up a few PDF documents and raise some alarms, which is how we kind of got into the investigation in the first place. That actually happens a lot. That happens a lot in organizations where you have a changing of the guard, and then that new person comes in, starts asking, good questions. And then all of a sudden they realize things don't add up or things don't reconcile, or there's money missing. And all of a sudden everyone's kind of up in arms and they need answers right away.
This scenario is all too common. And sometimes I've seen it go on for years and years and years. I don't remember the specific details, but some time ago there was a client situation where it was actually not a C-level person, but somebody much lower that was managing the money, but unsupervised, and managed to siphon off quite a lot to their personal accounts. So it's a big and common problem.
Yeah. And so the result of this one, we basically reported our findings back to the organization. And then I think the person then ended up departing from the organization. I'll just leave it at that. But again, our end result was to report the findings of quantifying the potential losses. And then the organization took that information and they took action after that.
Again, in California, I think the AG's, one of their first requirements is that a police report be filed to set in motion the criminal aspects of the theft. So it's a really tough situation, but all too common.
Yeah. And I've done investigations in California, and some of them were happy to see at the end of it that there really wasn't anything to report, and that it ended up being maybe just mismanaged funds or
that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think in some cases might be the best case scenario, because you have areas for improvement, but you don't have all of these other risks. Like I talked about, the reputational risks of something bad actually happened, or there was a bad actor that took money from the organization, for example.
All right. So example number 2, I think you had a few scenarios for us.
Yeah. So the second example is a INGO, or a nonprofit, non-governmental organization. So we end up doing a lot of these types of investigations also, because these are organizations that are US based. They have a US hub, but then they have country offices all over the world, and usually in third world countries that need support from the US. And so they're implementing US programs basically in these other countries. So this was an organization that was based in the US and then was operating in East Africa. And there was allegations of a finance person that had essentially stolen money through the payroll process for the organization. We were brought in on this one through an outside counsel. And that's, again, pretty common for us, where in this case, I think it was federal dollars that were at stake. And so obviously, if you're dealing with federal dollars and the investigation, all the risks in general, the stakes are much higher. And so that organization retained outside counsel, and then they retained us to do the forensic accounting aspects of this investigation. The key issues here turned out to be a lack of segregation of duties. We're going to get into that on the next couple of episodes as well. What does that mean, and how do you implement that? There also wasn't a ton of visibility or oversight from the central hub here in the US. And that was mostly because, which a lot of INGOs experience, there was a lack of resources for them here, right? So they're dealing with a skeleton team that's trying to oversee, I think it was close to 20, 30 country offices in other countries. And so it's hard enough to do that with a full-blown finance and accounting team, internal audit team, but this was just a few people in an office here in the US that was trying to manage and track expenses essentially all over the world. Unfortunately, these types of cases pop up a lot, and I'm sure your example is going to have a lot of the same risks and things that popped up. But the end result on this one is we were able to trace back that this person was essentially siphoning money out of the payroll process. They had been paying themselves as well as family members through payroll for years and years and years. And it turned out to be a similar situation where it was a new country leader that came into place. And it was right after that person came into place, and the next payroll that went out, they identified a discrepancy. And then the next day, that finance person quit. We were brought in, we did the investigation, and we found that, there's pretty clear trace of funding that was being paid out to this person on a weekly basis, basically for 4 or 5 years. And so obviously very unfortunate there, but we gave our report to the client, quantified the losses, gave them recommendations on, what controls could be improved going forward.
These international charities are particularly difficult, I think, because getting any satisfaction is really hard. So the scenario that came across my desk, and I'm curious what your advice would be when they, if this was first presented to you as a client question, which is, what can we do? The situation was it's a foreign operating charity in country A, let's say, that's serving the destitute. And it has a U.S. organization that's a 501c3 exempt, incorporated in the United States. That's what's known as a Friends of organization, an organization that raises money for the foreign entity, but it's not controlled by the foreign entity because that violates certain tax rules. So the Friends of organization has a board that doesn't include the operating charity or anybody on, that's actually doing the work in country A. The U.S. charity has this other board. The U.S. charity has filed IRS 990, their annual tax returns, that shows something on the order of, maybe $1 million in funds raised. And when our operating lead in country A finds out that there's all this money and says, well, okay, send me some. And the answer is, oh, well, it's all gone. By the way, the executive of the U.S. charity has moved to another country, somewhere else in the world. So the person in country A says, what can I do? Can I sue? Can I bring this to law enforcement? What's the starting point? What would you think in a situation like that? Where does someone even start when it's an international investigation? Let's say $1 million, not an insignificant amount of money, but I'm guessing kind of expensive to track down.
Obviously, the international aspect adds even more complicated elements to this. But I think regardless, on any investigation that we come into, when we have our initial scoping call, we always ask the clients, what do you want out of this? What is your end objective? And in some cases, if we really don't see a clear path to taking some form of action on the back end, that makes sense to do the full-blown investigation. It's really thinking about having the end in mind and then having that dictate what sort of review or analysis you do, if any. I would say in my experience, trying to prosecute or take action, legal action against individuals in other countries is very difficult, especially from a US-based organization's perspective. It's not to say that it's impossible. And I know at times the US government, for example, will take efforts and go after people in other countries and try to extradite them and, so on and so forth. But it's complicated. And so I think that's the general framework we keep, which is, what do you want to get out of this? And I have had clients where, because they had this issue pop up, it's obviously a firestorm inside of the organization. Everybody wants answers. But before you dive into sometimes what's like a 6-month, year-long, 18-month investigation, you really need to think about, well, what are we going to do with this information? If it's really just for learning purposes and you want to figure out what happened just to get answers, but there's no action to take, it might make more sense for you to focus more of those resources on fixing your controls, making sure you understand your processes, any weak points, and implementing those corrective actions going forward.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's some international scenarios, which have their own specialties to them. Let's talk about your third case study. What's new in that one?
Yeah. So that one was for a religious organization. The issue was, again, a C-level person. In this case, their email was spoofed, as in somehow someone got into their email account or created an account that looks sort of like their email account and was emailing the internal finance team asking for funds to be transferred to another country.
Ouch.
Yeah. So obviously very unfortunate again. In this case, we were brought in again by outside counsel. In this case, they were very large dollars. And I think that kind of triggered the threshold of, this is a very serious matter. And we, in some cases, were interested in getting the money back. We were retained by outside counsel, which was retained by the end client. We did the investigation for them. Some key issues that came out of this one in terms of the risks and why this issue may have been allowed to persist. The organization had approval policies that had not been adapted to remote working. And so obviously a lot of organizations were used to doing things in person in their offices, and they shifted to remote working and they had staff all over the country. The problem with that is that when you don't adapt your policies to remote working, you're used to just being able to walk into someone's office and say, hey, Susie, hey, Jim, did you send me an email asking for me to wire $1 million to this other country?
Right.
And we take those things for granted, but that didn't happen. And so essentially this finance person got an email saying, I need the money, I need it transferred. It was a persistent email campaign that they put on, and eventually the money was sent. And there was several million dollars, which for any exempt organization is a lot of money, in my opinion. And then the end result, we helped quantify the total dollars that were sent out and identified the control weaknesses that led to this issue. The organization actually, we were able on that case, work with local authorities and get the money back for the organization, as well as help them submit an insurance claim, which covered the remaining portion that we weren't able to get back. I wanted to end on a positive note there, and not that every case ends up in just complete failure and despair. That was a positive case where we were able to restore the funding back to the organization and help them again strengthen controls to move forward.
I'm guessing that whoever was doing the spoofing in that scenario was reachable by U.S. authorities and not an international bad actor. But I would think with an international one, it would be a bit tougher.
This is how that this got very sensitive very quickly. Like even I don't have a lot of clarity into the back end of how this happened, but I just know the FBI got involved.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of where I felt.
That helps.
Yeah.
I would imagine that definitely helps.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great overview. I hope it has caught the interest of a lot of our listeners. And I'm really looking forward to our next few episodes where we talk about how to protect against these scenarios. It's horrifying to think about what happens when they do happen, but we'll be much more upbeat in the next few episodes on how to prevent all this. So thanks for joining me today, Sly, and I look forward to our next couple of conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Cynthia.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources on these topics. Also, Farella, Braun, and Martel has a YouTube channel with organized playlists for all of the nonprofit EO Radio Show past episodes to make it easy to find information on topics relevant to you. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have any questions for Sly you would like addressed in our final episode, Ask a Certified Fraud Examiner, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.